webinar titled Best Management Practices for Hiring a Contract Lobbyist, hosted by the Florida League of Cities. I'm Megan Sir-Jane Samples, Legislative Advocate for the Florida League of Cities, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. The session will last approximately 1 hour, allowing for questions at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A section to submit your questions, or you may submit them to your webinar speaker via their contact information at a later time. I will read the questions you submit to the presenters to respond, so please make a notation if your question is for a particular presenter. Don't worry if the presenter is unable to answer your question during the webinar, or if we are unable to get to your question. We will be able to review all unanswered questions at the end and deliver a response after the webinar session has concluded. Also, the recorded version of the webinar will be posted in the FLC website at www.floridaleagueofcities.com under the Events and Training tab following the session. In addition, I want to inform everyone that we may experience a slight pause or delay during the presentation as we transition from one presentation to the other. Don't worry, the webinar isn't malfunctioning. It just sometimes takes a moment to transfer control of the webinar. Finally, before introducing the presenters, I wanted to quickly note that the municipal contract lobbyists have been chosen to be presenters in this webinar because of their long-term experience and scope of work representing local governments. However, if your city is interested in retaining a lobbyist, their participation in this webinar should not be interpreted as an endorsement by the Florida League of Cities. With that being said, our presenters today are Candace Eriks with Eriks Consultants, Bill Peebles, and John Wayne Smith of Peebles & Smith, who will be presenting today from the hired contract lobbyist perspective, and Rosemary Call, City Clerk for the City of Clearwater, who will be presenting from the municipal perspective. Candace Eriks is principal at Eriks Consultants, Inc., and also serves as the Vice President of Government Relations at Adams Street Advocates. Candace has developed an extensive network of contacts and relationships within state and local governments, as well as the business community. Candace works closely with the firm's South Florida-based clients and has developed broad expertise in numerous subject areas. After a successful start to a professional career in New York City, Candace returned to Florida in 1998 and opened the Fort Lauderdale office of Eriks Consultants. Candace is active in many charitable organizations and serves as an immediate past board member of ChildNet, a not-for-profit organization working to protect Broward County's abused, neglected, and abandoned children. Broward Days, an independent nonprofit and nonpartisan group of people advocating for diverse needs and concerns of Broward County, and the Florida Association of Professional Lobbyists, an organization committed to establishing and maintaining high standards for the lobbying profession. Bill Peebles is a Tallahassee lawyer and lobbyist. He has a Bachelor of Arts and Law degree from Florida State University, both with honors. Bill has represented local government clients before the Florida legislature since 1985. He has an extensive experience representing local government interests and includes among his clients Broward County and the cities of Orlando, Winter Park, Kissimmee, St. Petersburg, Tampa, Islamorada, and Tallahassee. He represents the Florida League of Cities, the Florida Association of Counties, the Florida Municipal Insurance Trust, the Florida Municipal Electric Association, and several other trade associations. John Wayne Smith is a registered state and federal lobbyist with the legislative and executive branches and is a principal of Peebles & Smith. He's a certified professional lobbyist by the Florida Association of Professional Lobbyists, or FAPL, and currently serves on the FAPL Board of Directors. Mr. Smith has 24 years of experience representing clients in Tallahassee and Washington, D.C. For the first 2 decades of his professional lobbying career, he served Florida's counties and municipalities, the last 5 as legislative director for the Florida Association of Counties. In addition, he performed a similar role for 8 years as assistant director for the Legislative and Public Affairs with the Florida League of Cities. Rosemary Call joined the City of Clearwater in 2002 as an administrative analyst and has served as the city clerk, legislative liaison, since September 2010. As legislative liaison, Rosemary works with staff and lobbying teams to develop the city's annual legislative agendas for federal and state priorities. Prior to the city, she was an administrative analyst for the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Citrus Canker Eradication Program in Miami. Rosemary holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from St. Leo University and earned her master's degree in Public Administration from Nova Southeastern University. On behalf of the Florida League of Cities, we thank our presenters for being with us today and for everyone participating in the webinar. I will now pass it over to John Wayne to begin their portion of the presentation.
Good afternoon, folks. This is John Wayne. We're going to go to the first slide. It's entitled Lobbying Season. I hope you can see it on your screen. This is a little bit of discussion. I would set the context when we talk about the season, and we're going to talk a little bit about when you hire and why these things are important. One of the things to keep in context is when you're going to hire a lobbyist and you're going to have some issues and some things that you're going to move forward, whether it's offensively or defensively, you understand the political process is competitive. And your legislators have only a certain amount of bandwidth. So there's competition for their time, there's competition for their attention, and there's competition for their priorities. So understanding that lobbying is a year-round process is important. And the things that are going on not outside of March and April are extremely important, because those things include developing relationships, developing your legislative program, and developing that program in the context of knowing what's politically sexy, what are the leadership priorities, what are the statewide issues, what other trends and things are happening, and do any of the issues that you're thinking about, is there a way to piggyback or ride a wave or benefit from some of the bigger things that are happening? For an individual entity like a city, when they're looking at hiring, knowing that season and knowing that there's a competition for the attention of the legislators is extremely important. So getting your team together, before August, before the fall is extremely important when you're looking at a timing, because in that summer and fall, as soon as you can, you want to be able to be developing what your issues are, developing the storylines, gathering the data and the information that are going to be supporting that, and be able to start educating people and testing, some of those issues out. So understanding that there is a year-round process and different phases of the lobbying are very important, particularly when you're looking at entering into the game. Those are just a few things to kind of be thinking about as you start. I'm going to stop for a second and just see if Candace has anything else to add to that.
Good afternoon, everyone. John, you pretty much hit on most of it. The best thing that I could add to is, obviously, you said when you should probably engage the person that you're going to have, because we have to remember that the majority of the work is done before January. So even though legislative session starts in March, your lobbyist needs to start laying the groundwork in August and September, even before that, with securing bill sponsors and things like that. And then also, recently, the rules have changed, and it has become harder to pass legislation. So the more proactive your lobbyist in your city can be, the better off you're going to fare during the legislative session and moving into the next year's coming.
Bill, you have anything to add?
Hey, this is Bill Peebles. No, I think just to emphasize what Candace and John both said, that in terms of where we are in the legislative season, John and I right now are reaching out to existing clients to talk to them in particular about what their appropriations issues will be for the coming year, and not so much, and I know Candace does this too, not just to ask them what they want, but to talk to them about, in a little broader way, what's important in their community, and to try to help them focus on areas where it might be more fruitful to ask for legislative help. And so it's a process that takes a while, because you have to get the government to sort of focus on the things that are important to them. Then you have to sort through from those things which ones are likely legislative projects. And then you have to ideally reach out to potential partners, university system, transportation folks, just, you have to, building support for these projects once you've identified the best projects takes some time. So as Candace and John said, now's the time to be starting that process.
And then also, John, if I could just add to that too, because it sparked something that Bill just said, your lobbyists also need to be aware and have the pulse of what's happening locally too, because balancing between local realities and state realities. I mean, knowing what a local situation is could very well become a state issue, which happens quite often on a local, with the biggest cities and with people around the state. So we need to be, your lobbyists, you need to have them engaged so they can get involved as soon as possible to be sure that people in Tallahassee know what might be happening and heading their way.
Agreed. All right, I think we can move to the next slide, and I'm going to test this and make sure that I can do it correctly. And Candace is going to take front and center on the first slide here.
Okay, so what can a lobbyist do? And basically what we are is we're your eyes, ears, and voice in Tallahassee. Anything and everything that affects our clients, whether it's a bill that could harm our cities or an opportunity to get grant money, we're the quarterback for that. We continually educate our clients on those realities and the time constraints that Tallahassee has. We obviously can advance or stop legislation, amend legislation to make it more palatable for the cities and for the local community. We also continually work with agencies. Many agencies have rule hearing process where they will change a rule, and your lobbyist needs to be aware and on the pulse of what those rule hearings are and what the changes are so they can communicate it back to your local government, and you can go back to staff and find out how it affects you. And then also we act as a liaison with our cities through a lot of the agencies. We work many times with the Department of Transportation and with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, whether it be sign permitting, whether it be construction projects. We need to be involved with the beginning of those projects, the planning process, all the way through to make sure that not only our cities are accountable for what they need to do, but also for what the agency said that they were going to do, and keep them on a timely schedule to make sure the project gets done in a timely manner. And then obviously for budget, many years there were community budget requests. That money went away for a while and now it's back. So with that, there is a process that requires detailed information. As Bill said earlier, we are working with our cities as well. They are doing studies. They are finding out what they need to be able to put in those budget priorities for the information for the legislature to even consider some of the asks that we'll be making for them up in Tallahassee. And then after that happens, we then craft a strategic, compelling, and focused message that differentiates and positions the appropriations request. And I'm sure Bill and John have additional responsibilities that they can add to that.
You covered it really well, Candace. I just think the main point for a local government entity, a city that is looking for help from a lobbyist, is to understand that it's a very diverse world of tasks, and there's a variety of things that a lobbyist can be used for. And I think that's the mindset that a city needs to have. It can be as small as a project where the city calls the lobbyist because DOT has put cones in front of all the businesses, and you just need to, make a quick phone call. Or it can be just the lobbyist giving a city a heads up about an opportunity that they think may be coming up either in the legislative process or in an agency rulemaking process, or looking at a new grant application process. The lobbyist is able to give their client a little bit of a head start or a heads up, knowing a little bit about how something may look or appear before it comes out. So the main message on this particular slide is to think broadly and diversely and know that there's multiple things a lobbyist can do. I think that there can be a mindset that a lobbyist, again, only works during March and April and only chases a budget item or kills a bill or passes a bill. But when it comes to helping local government, it's almost the list never stops. I don't know. It's probably still a blank sheet of paper. We probably haven't been asked to do everything yet. There's always something new that kind of comes up. And I'll just take a stop there and just see if Bill has anything that he wants to add.
I don't.
All right. Well, let's do the third slide. Did I hit it right? Nope. Am I pushing the wrong button? There we go. So now let's talk a little bit about the process and how you select a lobbyist. There's kind of two processes that are out there that are used a lot. One is an RFP process. One is there may be just a select group of firms that a particular city or entity knows about and just kind of brings them in, and then you can hybrid that and include both. But there's probably no one set way to do it, and we're going to talk a little bit more about RFPs and using the criteria. A couple things that I just suggest if folks do use RFPs or want to use an interview process is think a little bit about the team and the people that you want to include. My suggestion is to think, in terms of what the entity's leadership team looks like. So if it's the city manager, the city manager's office, if they have internally someone who focuses on intergovernmental relations. I think having folks from the planning department, someone from budgeting or public works helps, but it should be, I think, a group of folks that are kind of in that policy arena and that think broadly and are part of the leadership and the visionary team of the city. And then we're going to talk more a little bit specifically about the criteria, but you do need to kind of think about that and what are the things that you want to evaluate and focus on when you get your solicitations back. What are the things you want to grade on, or what are the things you're looking for? We have interviews on here, and they can be done separately or they can be jointly and be part of an RFP process. From my experience, and I've been on both sides because I've hired contract lobbyists and I've been the interviewee and had to answer the questions, I think interviews are important. I mean, I never hired anyone by just looking at their resume, and so I felt always that if I was going to work with someone that there would be some process where I get to see them, ask them some questions, and get to know them a little bit. I think that's very important for the chemistry and for other things that you may be able to learn that you just don't get on a piece of paper. So I encourage entities when they're looking at selecting a lobbyist to do that, and you can look at that whether or not it's through the evaluation team or in the case of a city as to whether or not you want to take advantage or bring in your elected officials in that process as well. Those are decisions that the city can make, but from my perspective, I just emphasize that the interview process, I think, is an important one, and I see that left out a lot of the processes that we go through. So I'll stop there and just see if Candace has anything that she would like to add there, and then we'll see what Bill is thinking.
Well, thank you. And yes, I do agree with that. I haven't been hiring a lobbyist, obviously, but I have been in a process where there has not been interviews been had, and after the, only so much can be taken from a piece of paper. So I think that interviewing the person that you're going to have representing you up in Tallahassee is very important on the decision-making process of how you proceed forward. And then also, I just wanted to add, I mean, I know how many people use the RFP process and they use programs such as BidSync and DemandStar, but I also find that suggesting this to the rest of you might be a good idea, because I do believe that having somebody in your community is important. You might want to utilize your local league and go through your local league for distribution for firms in your area as well. That would be a good place to start for your associate membership. So it's something that somebody who's already working with your local league and that obviously has ties in with your Florida league as well. So that's all I wanted to add.
Bill, you got anything you want to add?
I do.
I found what Bill cares about. Here we go.
I have a particular, I guess, thought about this. Most of you probably have some kind of mandatory procurement process for selecting professional consultants. And my experience, which has now gotten to be pretty long, is that often somebody turns to the folks in your shop who typically do the procurements and say, draft me an RFP for lobbying services. And they'll reach out to some other cities and they'll look at what other RFPs have looked like. But very often I think the people who are drafting those RFPs are also probably more often drafting RFPs for police cars and pipe for the water and wastewater system and maybe engineering services. We see RFPs. I see RFPs sometimes that just you wonder if anybody actually read it and thought about what it is you're procuring in this situation, because they ask questions that just really are not pertinent to what you ought to be trying to get at in a selection process. And I think what you ought to be trying to get at is it somebody who has experience? What is their experience? What's their general approach? And then just to reiterate what John said, I think interviews are really important, and I think they're really important because ideally, when you select a lobbyist, you're going to be entering into a long-term relationship with somebody or some firm that really is going to become you in Tallahassee, Florida. We represent the city of Tampa, for example, and have for a long, long time. And when people in Tallahassee think of the city of Tampa, they think of John and me. And so who you hire needs to be somebody who, not just who you're comfortable with, who you sort of, you know, you've met them and you're comfortable and you understand that they're good at their job, but they need to be somebody who, the way I think of it is somebody who you would be proud to have represent you in Tallahassee. And I don't think you can know that if you don't really kick the tires some. So I guess that's just sort of some random thoughts about selection process.
All right. So now we're going to move, and I'm going to see if I hit this button right. Then we're going to talk a little more about criteria. And these are some of the things that we see generically or kind of on a frequency basis. And I'm going to let Candace lead us off on this slide.
Thanks, John, and I agree with a lot with what Bill said, and so this brings me to things to consider. I mean, for me, and I'm sure that my colleagues on the phone will agree with me that, you know, reputation is the best way to evaluate a lobbyist. I mean, speak to their references that they give you, as well as to your colleagues. I mean, do they work within the legal and ethical standards? Look at their client relationships. Look at how long they've represented their clients. You know, how long have they been involved in the legislative process? Look at their areas of expertise based on their current client list and ask them to elaborate on successes. Other things to consider too, location. You want someone who can understand the needs of your community, the challenges that you have locally. You need to look at access and advocacy. Not only can they open the doors on the Republican side and the Democratic side, but also can they advocate on complicated issues and make somebody from North Florida understand what the challenges of people down here in South Florida have. And also, as we touched on the relationships on both sides of the aisle, how well do they work with the Florida League of Cities? How well do they work with the local league, their local league cities? I mean, they are the person that you are sending up there to work in conjunction with both of those entities. So that's something that I would suggest that you consider when selecting somebody. And do you guys have, oh, and also, of course, I'm going to give a plug for the Florida Association of Professional Lobbyists. You know, are they a member of that firm? I mean, they spend all year long doing ongoing education, professional development, and ethics. So that's important. And also, I would emphasize when you're selecting somebody, use the league, balance considerations off of them. They're, like I said, they're your backup in Tallahassee. So they're going to be the ones working directly with the people that you hire. John, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think you've hit a lot of the high points. I think that there are some advantages in today's world, though, for folks that are looking at hiring lobbyists than maybe there were, 10 or 20 years ago. There's a lot of upfront research that entities can do on their own. Right now, with the lobbyist registration, anybody can go online and do some background research on folks. Look at client lists, look at compensation reports and things like that. And when you're looking at the client list, you can get a sense right up front whether or not they have local governments, in their bucket, and if they have experience doing that. And then with a lot of the firms, you can kind of group, some of the other clients. You can kind of tell, who does a lot of healthcare stuff versus who does a lot of insurance stuff versus who does what. And those kind of give you some generic things to think about and to learn about with some of the firms. It's all right there for anyone to see. I think another thing that's advantageous that didn't exist before is you can go straight to the web. And a lot of firms We, others, have our own websites where we have information about ourselves and the things that we do, our clients, and what we've been doing for them. LinkedIn is another place to go and get some information about folks. So understand there's broader and bigger buckets to kind of go out there and figure out how you want to learn about some of these things. To be specific, to talk about just some of the criteria, know that when you're talking about qualifications or experience, you know, from me, what I would be looking for is success. That's one of the bigger things, and to see if there's been success in things that would be similar to some of the things that you would care about. So when you're developing a scope of work or asking for experiences, you can kind of tailor that a little bit. You know, you can put in there, share with the city, have you had success, or have you worked in this area, and what successes have you had fixing the law here or getting money to help in this instance. You don't have to just make it totally generic. If you already kind of have an idea about what you really care about or what's important in your community, you can tailor some of your questions for the criteria and the kinds of responses that you want. You can look at the qualifications for the team, their personnel backgrounds, what they did before they were a lobbyist, other experiences that they've had if they worked internally in the process or for an agency or for the governor's office, if they actually served in the legislature, and get a sense of what other experiences part of their team has. That's one good way to kind of evaluate, you know, some of the firms. Approach is kind of a unique thing, and I see the approach asked in a variety of ways. The one thing I guess I would suggest if you're evaluating or going to look at that is make sure that they are looking at it as a year-round approach, and that they're not just talking about what they do from January through April or May or even a shorter time frame. A lobbying firm that is speaking to or thinking about engaging with the municipality needs to be coming at it from, you know, 365 kind of day approach. And then the last thing I'll just mention is cities are very different in how they kind of go about this. We work with some cities that have teams of lobbyists. We work with some cities that have both state and federal lobbyists. But I think knowing that that whoever you're bringing on board plays well with others is a positive, and you want to know that if you're going to have a team approach, that chemistry is going to be there, and that you're going to coordinate if you have federal lobbying to leverage what you're working on. You don't want to send your state guys off working on some things and your federal guys don't know what they're doing, and vice versa. You really, in today's world, want to be looking at coordination, because everybody's looking for skin in the game. So they're looking for local skin in the game, they're looking for state skin in the game, and if they see those things, then it's easier to work the federal process, and vice versa. If you've got local skin in federal, the state likes to see that. They like to know that they're investing in things that other people are investing in. So that's one other thing to kind of think about when you're looking at putting together criteria or things that you want to evaluate and compare different firms and looking at a lobbyist. So I'll stop there and see if Bill has anything to add. He's over here making a lot of notes, so he's gearing up. Here he goes.
Well, just a couple of things. The last bullet on this slide is fees. And obviously, the fee is an important consideration, but I would just urge you not to be penny wise and pound foolish. And by that, I just mean, you know, if you overweight, for example, a lot of RFPs will have weighted criteria. If you overweight fee and a firm comes in, say, $5,000 less than another firm, and so they get 20 points for being the best fee, but the firm that you select, because they were $5,000 less, is not able to bring home a $500,000 appropriation, then that wasn't a very successful procurement process. So I think it's important to ask about fees and to think about fees, and I think it's important, if there are wide disparities in fees, to try to understand why. But I would urge that you not overemphasize the importance of fees. And I think we're going to talk a little about that later. There's a range. People in the business know sort of what the right fee is for most of what you're going to want to have done, and they're going to be within $10,000 or $20,000 of each other. And then a bullet that's not on here that I think ought to be is conflicts. I think it's really important for you to ask in the RFP about potential conflicts, and also about approach when conflicts arise. I know some of the league staff lobbyists frequently are fussing at people like Candace and John and me, who do a lot of city work, about other city lobbyists who they think they can reach out to for help on this or that or the other municipal issue, and they discover very often that they're not available on a lot of different issues because of sort of their client base. And I think firms that have a heavier client list, or a client list that's heavier on local governments, probably you run into fewer conflict problems, although even that, I've had cities who were in conflict with one another. And so I think you need to ask them not just about prospective conflicts, but also about how they mean to handle them. Lobbyists are not governed by, for example, the Florida Bar Lawyers Code of Ethics. And if you're a lawyer, there's a set of rules that you know what you're supposed to do in the event of a conflict. If you're a lobbyist, it's not always entirely clear. In fact, some would argue that there aren't very many lobbyists who even can recognize a conflict. So you really ought to try to make them disclose potential conflicts to you and tell you what they propose to do about them when they arise.
Okay, so we're going to move, and we're going to talk a little bit more, and I call these the intangibles. I think it's my turn to go first. So, you know, we spoke a little bit about the interview process, and I think some of these things probably can come out a little bit better in that, but you can figure out some of these with your research, and depending on how you ask your questions in an RFP, there's ways to evaluate some of these things too. But, you know, having a winning and a positive attitude, and knowing that the firm that you hire cares about winning, I think is important. You don't want to be bringing on someone where losing is okay. We play and we participate in a very competitive process, so the folks that you engage, you want to know that they get amped up and like participating in that process. I think so. That's important. For local governments, because they participate in the process in a different way, a lot of times the local governments, when they're not participating so much up front in the campaign parts or operating and managing PACs and things like that, your team, you want to know that they're problem solvers and they're very creative. And not only in the legislative process, but when they come and visit with you and you start talking about the things that you might want to pursue, you're going to want to look at them at different times as quasi-staff and being help you to figure out how do you get from point A to B and C, and knowing that they have that capability to assist is very important. The last two bullets I have down here are elected officials and local government, and I think Bill spoke to some of this before and said it in a different kind of way. But when you hire or you engage someone to represent you in Tallahassee, there are some things that if we're representing a mayor or city council people and things like that, we behave and we operate in a certain way because we are looked at as the face for those elected officials and for that community. So when we're working with their delegation, or if we're trying to make appointments and get involved with an agency or the governor's office, you know, our mission and our reputation has been one to consider and think of ourselves as part of that community and being there in the suit representing that mayor, or that council. And so that professionalization, that image, those are important. And having an experience working with elected officials and having multiple bosses at the end of the day is going to be important as well. We're going to talk a little bit about how you manage that, but you do need to have some experience working with multiple bosses, and cities typically have boards of 5 or more and mayors, and so balancing some of those things can come down to being very important as well. So I'm going to take a time out there now and see first if Candace has anything else to add, and then let Bill jump in.
No, I think you hit it all. So, I mean, anything that I had prepared for that, I mean, the main thing is obviously, yes, attitude is key, and lobbyists must know their audience, but, you know, because we do need to sell a message, you know, to people from North, Central, and South Florida. So, I mean, those issues need to be relevant to each area, and that requires creativity and fast thinking, and you know, that goes into and tying into the problem solving. There's lots of cooks in the kitchen for one dish a lot of the time in Tallahassee, so they need to be aware of that, and they need to understand that those message, the message can be quite difficult at times.
Bill, you got anything?
I think there's one thing that might be a little different when you're a local government hiring a lobbyist than if maybe you're a private entity. There is often sort of a feeling that you want to get the guy or the girl, woman who is closest to this speaker or this appropriations chairman. I think of it as sort of the flavor of the month lobbyist hiring approach. And I think for a local government, that's a thing to be avoided because, as I said earlier, your relationship with a lobbyist should be a long-term relationship. They're going to become part of your team, part of your city's management team. They're going to learn your issues over time. They're going to become you here, as we said. And I think the idea that, well, this fella happens to be really close to this Senate president, you know, if you have a one-shot big deal issue, sometimes that's the right way to pick somebody, but for local governments, I believe that it is not very often the right way to pick somebody. So I would just sort of steer. You want people, obviously, who are engaged with legislators and legislative leadership, but you don't want a flavor of the month kind of approach, I don't think.
That's a good point there. So we covered this one, and we're going to talk a little bit more. Bill, talk some about the fees, and you know, I just entitled this slide as market rates, just to kind of give folks some background on what the cost can be. But there are also some things that can be a little unique and different for local governments and cities because of the nature. I'm going to let Candace start on this one, and then we'll follow up. Candace, you want to give us your thoughts on fees?
I will, and in the essence of time, I will be very brief, and then you can add whatever, John, as we move forward. But, I mean, the majority of us work, I know, if you're a full-service firm, you usually work on an annual retainer, which is the price is based on the needs of the jurisdiction. And for us, I know that it includes both appropriations and policy. We don't price accordingly to how big the appropriation is or how small the appropriation is. But, you know, it is public records, so you can always ask your neighbors and look up, you know, what they pay for your surrounding areas. And also, you know, be clear about your expectations to your lobbyists so that the lobbyists can price accordingly. So they know, you know, the work is always more than what we think it's going to be, but this way they at least know how much they're going to need to put for their resources for a certain lift or an ask. So depending on the legwork needed for the lift, you want to add to that, John?
Yeah, my recommendation to local governments and cities in particular is I haven't really felt that whatever the Tallahassee market rate model always fit well. I think I see more consistency there with some of your larger local governments, but because Florida has so many small cities and medium-sized cities, I think that there's a tremendous amount of flexibility. And in the audience, you know, if you're, you know, doing this for the very first time, I've even seen where there's even greater flexibility in when you're establishing that relationship that that you can back into whatever we call the market rates, and that you can build up to that in kind of a tester model. So, I try to tell folks, if you can come up with a budget or something that you think you can afford, I think that long-term, and Bill's been talking about the long-term commitment, is you get back what you invest in lobbying at the state level, at the federal level. If you're doing look at this long-term and just say a 5-year period, you ought to be looking in after 5 years as a 10-to-1 return on investment. And that's looking at the monetary side of a lot of the things that we've worked on with our clients. But there are special projects that come up, local bills, claims bills, and things like that, and there's a lot of flexibility in that respect as well. I think most of our comments on this particular slide, it is kind of the full service, kind of do everything lobbyist, but you can silo some of the work that we do as well, if that's kind of the will of that particular community. Bill, you got anything you want to add?
The only thing I would add that may be obvious is lobbyists work on retainers. I guess you could find some who will work for an hourly rate, but don't expect that, because it's just not the right way for the lobbyist or for the city to price these services. And so anticipate paying an annual retainer, and as John said, those are the right number will eventually. Our policy in our office has been that the first year doesn't necessarily matter. It's the third year that counts. And so over time, the fee will get right for both of you. And I think that's probably an important thing to remember as you approach it.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about developing the scope of work, and I just think, for me, it's the second bullet, and these are words that I've borrowed from Bill because he throws this around the office all the time, and that's, what are we graded on? We're talking, from the perspective of the entity that's going to hire a lobbyist. You got to get your arms around what are those things, that 1, 2, 3, whatever those priorities. There's going to be a bunch of stuff that happens, and folks are going to ask and call about this bill or that bill, or did you hear about this? But defining what your lobbyists are going to be graded on, that's key. You want to get that nailed down, and you want to get consensus at the staff level and running that up the flagpole, whether it's the mayor or the city manager, or if it happens to be the whole city council that has to sign off on that. But you want to outline and specifically define what it is and what your expectations are from your lobbying team. Candace, you got anything you want to add on that?
I think pretty much hit most of them. The main thing would be, that there are no guarantees, obviously, in the legislative process. No matter how hard a lobbyist works, language can take several years to pass, like Bill said, the first year and third year. But, political deals can be made that are unrelated to your issue but ultimately affect your issue. So, always take that into consideration, too. And, make your lobbyists accountable. You're accountable to your constituents, so you need to absolutely hold your lobbyists accountable for their contract and for their work and for their communication back to you.
Awesome. Bill, you got anything?
Nope.
All right. I think we're on our last slide, and this is just something. You've hired one. Now what do you do with one if you catch one? But managing a lobbyist is very, very important, and particularly in the model for cities and local government. A recommendation and a suggestion that we try to work out with the folks that we work with in the local government world is to have a point person. We call them an air traffic controller, but it's that person that is the central point of information, whether it's the contact and communication with the lobbyist, but also for the city, the person that if there's information needed or opinions needed, that person is the one that reaches out to the other department folks and the other staff and coordinates the collection of information. You don't want to have a very messy process where everybody in the city is just grabbing the phone and calling your lobbyist and reporting, because we work on very short, quick timelines, and you want that to be a very seamless process. So that's just one of the things that if you get the things that we're graded on, who's going to be your point of contact for the entity? Anything else, Candace, on that?
No, I mean, I think you hit it. I think the point person, streamlining the communication, and, you know, simply also have them, as you're managing a lobbyist, have them do reports, report back to you. I mean, I like to provide weekly written reports during session and committee weeks. And then, you know, we're in contact with our clients, you know, throughout the year as well. But, you know, make sure that communication stays open and frequent. Again, it's key to mutual success.
Absolutely. Bill, you got anything to add? No. All right. Well, I think that wraps up our part of the presentation, and I think now we're going to kick it over to Rosemary, and then we'll do some Q&A when Rosemary is done.
Hello. I realize, given the time frame, and my information today might sound a little bit repetitive, but from what we've heard earlier, but I just wanted to first, as background, explain that I'm really going to be presenting information from the municipality's perspective. And just for background, for the City of Clearwater, the city has contracted a state lobbyist since 1996 and a federal lobbyist since 1998. And during that time, since I've been here, I've been involved with at least 3 RFPs cycles with both the federal and the state lobbyists. So the information today are insights that we have learned since then, and as we have adapted our scope of services in response to the change in economic times, climate, and our needs have changed as well. The need for lobbying services is obviously going to be unique for each municipality. As you can leverage your existing resources versus your needs, you obviously, one of the most popular reasons for hiring a lobbyist would be for funding requests for underfunded projects, whether by means of a grant, a community budget request, or a legislative appropriation. They can help identify potential funding sources that are aligned with your city's strategic plan. They can also work with stakeholders to draft legislation in hopes of securing passage of that legislation to address a community need, whether that be providing tax dollars to renovate a spring training baseball stadium, changing membership requirements to your local tourist development council to secure a seat for your municipality, or securing passage of a local bill authorizing temporary alcohol permits to outdoor events. And lastly, and probably one that is not really discussed very often, I believe, is hiring a lobbyist to provide assistance in resolving agency-related matters. For instance, lobbyists, they typically have built relationships with key agency staff and legislators that can provide insight and information that may not otherwise be obtained. And recently, the city had requested assistance from our federal lobbyists to resolve an administrative matter with a federal agency that involved returning grant funds that were used to purchase lands for retention ponds. And we all know that when we need to dispose of lands that were purchased with grant funds, there are some hoops to go through. And the letter of the law, particularly at the federal level, is pretty clear, but we were just having difficulty receiving some type of guidance in terms of what our allowable expenses could be deducted from the monies owed to the agency. And this had taken some time, but luckily our federal lobbyist was able to schedule a meeting and with the appropriate agency staff as well as with our congressman, and it was really at that point that we were finally able to come to some resolution. So they're obviously, because of the relationships and their connections, can provide some insight in maybe approaching a problem in a completely different way that you may not have otherwise considered. So when after you've identified your need, you are now going to be drafting your request for proposal. And your RFPs should really provide the expected deliverables as clearly outlined and specific to your needs. They need to be clear and outlined, requiring timely assessments and reports regarding legislation, budgetary and regulatory issues affecting your city, not just during session but throughout the year. It's very important that, again, they're your eyes and ears. Requiring the qualified respondent to maintain a presence in Tallahassee or DC. Firm location is crucial, particularly when advocating for certain issues, particularly at the state level when session is short or even throughout the year. It's easier for them to advocate on your behalf participate in legislative hearings, meet with those key agency staff and legislative staff when they're available to walk across the street, so to speak. They should be able to provide timely information and advice on state or federal funding opportunities to support your city programs. And this is one where recently we've, in the last couple of years, have geared more towards, and that is finding lobbying firms that include a strategic grant component that includes identifying grant opportunities that are applicable to your city priorities. Now they can even, some of them even offer reviewing grant applications prior to submittal and obtaining letters of support from legislators. They're really, it does take a lot of that task away from the staff. Requiring travel to municipality to report on activities or even to represent your city at the local legislative hearing as directed. And lastly, the qualified respondent should be able to work in conjunction with the Florida League of Cities in support or opposition of legislation and agency rules affecting cities. So long as there's no conflict with the city's legislative agenda, the lobbyist should be able to collaborate with league staff on your behalf. When drafting your RFP, include demonstrable qualifications, and some of the ones that these are the ones that we particularly use, and that is experience in the legislative process. The respondent should have the ability to represent local government clients to the legislature, and they should also be able to include a list of references and contact person regarding their ongoing relationships with members of the legislature. They should be able to provide a record of successful working relationships with state agencies and provide background on firm history and size. In addition to firm location, the size of the firm is also important. Keep in mind the number of clients and the size of the firm. You want to make sure that they will be able to attend to your needs and to your workload. Respondents should also be able to provide accomplishments of public sector projects and initiatives. The last 5 years, we ask that they describe not only their accomplishments, but to describe their outcomes and how they measured their successes within those projects. They should be able to provide lists of clients for whom similar services were provided. The proposed work plan should clearly describe their approach to provide the required scope of services, list of individuals to provide the services, and their resumes describing qualifications, credentials, and relevant experience. The response should also include total cost to perform services with a breakdown providing hourly rate and total cost. Travel and out-of-pocket expenses as well as the payment terms and schedule of payment should also be outlined in the response. The RFP expected timeline, and this might be the city clerk and me, and I think it's very important that the expected timeline for the RFP is included. Advise your respondents when the evaluating committee will review proposals, when the presentations by finalists will occur, and when governing body is expected to approve the contract. It is a best practice to require presentations from the top 2 finalists at the very least. This will provide the review committee an opportunity to ask questions regarding the proposed work plans. Also gather insight that they were not able to receive just through the paper proposals. And in regarding the outline criteria, the evaluation and the ranking process, it's very important that's clearly outlined as well for respondents to understand how their proposals will be reviewed and weighed. These are the criteria that we use, and that is overall quality of work plan. Is the proposed work plan complete and thorough? Experience. Is the history and background documented and relevant to local government? Qualifications, do the individuals providing services have the knowledge and training? And obviously, of course, the reports from references. What do their clients say? And last but not least is cost of services. Now, cost of services for the city is on the least weight. It's definitely weight on the least, but that's because we definitely want to make sure that we don't go with the lowest bid and then be concerned with the ability of the firm to provide the services that we are expecting of them. And then once selected, it is important to establish communication guidelines with your contract lobbyist. Identify the contact person on city staff responsible for funneling information and requests. And I believe this would be the individual that should be part of your RFP evaluation committee. This will assure your lobbyist is not pulled in different directions or tasked with items that have not been approved by the corporate body. The city's annual legislative agenda provides them with their marching orders, and issues not included should really go before the corporate body before any action is being taken, and of course that's unless it falls within the city manager's authority. Engage your lobbying team in the drafting stages of your legislative agenda. Provide a copy of the League's legislative agenda. Who better to help identify issues and opportunities that are not on your radar screen? I know I definitely, when it comes to our state lobbyists, I provide the League's legislative agenda, but even before it's finalized, I really do keep them abreast as to what the League is discussing and what issues we may be considering in terms of supporting or opposing. Although covered in your contract, discussing potential conflicts of interest when identified is important. We hear it time and again, it's about relationships, and it is important that both parties feel comfortable discussing potential concerns. For example, your legislative advocate may be representing an established client who supports legislation that may negatively impact your community, or they may also be representing another local government seeking funds from the same budget programs, such as a state and tribal assistance grant at the federal level. Here the lobbyist may be able to work with both clients and rework the application to address a regional need, thus making the application a stronger funding request. But should a conflict not be resolved in favor of the city, the contract should really provide language that clearly describes how it will be resolved and addressed. And in closing, obtaining a contract lobbyist should not replace your current advocacy efforts but enhance those endeavors. They should be catered to your specific needs. They should provide strategic governmental relation program development and planning, and your contract lobbyist should assist with neutralizing or defeating legislation that negatively impacts your community. Remember, their successes should not only be measured by the funds they bring to the table, but also by their efforts to secure legislation that enhances and positively impacts your community. And that would be my last slide. I tried to close it up make it as quick as possible given the time frame.
Thank you, Rosemarie. So we'll go ahead and move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. Just to let everybody know, we are going to extend it a little bit longer because we've got some great questions coming in that I want our lobbyists to answer in real time. So the first question I'm going to direct towards John Wayne, and that is, what is the full service market rate?
Who's the question from? You know, right now when we see kind of our longer term clients, and what I think is kind of happening in Tallahassee, and you can go online and verify this, but somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000 is kind of what's going for the full service market rate. Now again, I say that with a caveat that, you know, a city of the size of Archer or Newberry or Micanopy or whatever, that's probably not going to be the expectation, and neither would it be for a medium-sized city as well. So there are some things to consider when you're talking about market rates, when you're looking at the size of the city and the type of scope of work and the types of priorities that you may be asking folks to work on. So know that that none of those are fail-safe. I'll stop. I don't know if Bill or Candace has anything to add to that.
Candace?
I would just add, this is Candace, that, you know, it also depends on the duration and how long you've had the client. I mean, somebody who you're hiring or going into business with today may be a different price than somebody you've had for the last 15 years. So that might be a differential as well. So.
Good question.
All right, this next one I'm going to direct towards Bill to start off with, and it's in the rural areas, we have different needs than other areas. Are there many lobbyists that specialize in the rural areas that are also in the RACEC regions?
They're also in the
RACEC, the R-A-C-E-C.
That's actually probably a better question for John. There are folks, I think, who specialize in local governments, and I think there are people who have experience representing smaller governments. I don't know that there are folks who specialize in smaller governments, partly because, if for no other reason than there aren't enough of them who are hiring lobbyists to make that a full-time practice, truthfully. I think it's interesting, not to talk too much about a particular circumstance, but we brought in a rural client, a small client, a couple of years ago, and I think it was a stretch for them to have a lobbyist. And it's funny, it takes as much work to represent a small client, sometimes more, than it does to represent a big one. So I guess if the question was, are there folks specializing in that? I don't think so, but I do know that there are folks who have experience in representing small governments as well as large governments.
Yeah, I think it happens kind of indirectly, but there are 3 or 4 firms that I can think of that would be in what I call the Central Florida area, and that would be like the DeSoto, Hendry, Hardy area that have evolved from city management and other things that have now evolved into doing government relations, and I know they do a lot of work in that particular region. I know that there's a small county coalition and a group of lobbyists that kind of work around it in some of those areas, and I can think of some of the folks that have kind of piggybacked and helped on some of the individual projects too. But a lot of it is regional in terms of where they're from and where they started. But I don't know that there are firms that are designed or specifically market themselves to be in that specialty. But you can find some folks who kind of have that client list that kind of look like that.
Well, to add to that, the question is, what if my city has limited resources to hire a contract lobbyist? What can I get with those limited resources?
Well, I think I mentioned, this is Bill, I think I mentioned that at one point when I was talking a little bit. In our firm, we'll take clients in. I was actually talking to somebody in a very small city yesterday, and our goal, and I think most lobbying firms' goal should be, as I said, not the first-year fee, but the third-year fee. It's about developing a long-term relationship. And so I think for somebody who wants to sort of get started and see if they like the relationship and see if they believe that in the long run it will yield dividends, as John said, 10-to-1 return, I think is a reasonable return to expect. I think you can probably interest legitimate lobbying firms for $25,000 or $30,000 for something. Frankly, I think if somebody comes around and says they'll do it for less, they're probably not really the kind of folks you want to, from whom you should expect a whole lot of results, truthfully.
Great. The next one I'm going to direct towards Candace, and this one is, even though the League of Cities offers advocacy services, why would a contract lobbyist be beneficial for a city?
Well, I mean, we deal, and I'll say this, I mean, we work very closely with the League, but there are certain things that, the League goes through, and they're about to do their policy meetings next on September 12th. And, there's a process that the League goes through, and they pick only their 2 or 3, I think you guys only have 3 priorities. So those 3 priorities are pretty much the blanket effect of all the state of Florida. And many cities have unique issues that they need passed or stopped or certain appropriations. And the League is not going to work for an individual city for an appropriation the way somebody as an extended arm of your city, such as your lobbyist, is going to work, 24/7 for that 1, 2, 3 appropriation. So, I mean, overall policy that could, affect cities, the League is fantastic. They're wonderful. We love them. But when it comes down to individual unique asks, they are spread thin on their resources, representing 400 and something cities where you're tailored to that one focus when you're retained by that city and local jurisdiction.
Great.
Do you have anything to add to that, Bill, John?
Do you guys have anything to add?
I don't know. Restate the question because I was trying to make sure that I understood it.
I can tell you. I'll catch this follow up on this. You should not. Nobody should hire a lobbyist to supplement the League of Cities efforts because they're really good at what they do and they are across the board. But as Candace said, there are often issues that are of particular importance in your city that are just going to be beyond what the League can or will take care of. And I was just sort of making some notes on some things we've done over the years with the League, but they were just really important to particular clients. For example, I've passed, I don't know, a dozen open records bills in the last 10 years for different folks who had different, very particular problems with open records. Local bills sometimes. We've worked recently with League folks, but really there are only 12 cities who are impacted by state university system campuses. And it's just unreasonable for those 12 cities, 13 cities now, to expect the Florida League of Cities to devote the kind of resources to dealing with some of those particular problems that they have to devote to problems that affect all 415 cities. And so there are a lot of circumstances where there's just something of some particular local importance, besides appropriations, where I think a little extra emphasis is valuable, and the League appreciates it. I work with, like Candace, John and I work really closely with the League lobbyists, and you know, they're glad for that kind of help.
Great. The next question I'm going to direct towards Rosemarie, and that is, what questions should we be asking during an interview with a lobbyist?
I definitely think some of the questions that we have asked during the interview process are asking details regarding the successes or their latest programs that they're listing, that their accomplishments with their clients, asking about their clients. Another thing we do ask as well is if we notice that we have, or if the firm has plenty of Florida clients or very local clients, we do ask them in terms of questions regarding who would be the team providing the services to us, if there is a conflict, how the firm may address a conflict situation. So those are questions that we ask in terms of as you go through the RFP, are there items in the proposal that is not clear? Sometimes even asking regarding their experience in local governments. That's very common when you're going through the RFP process to find firms who has at least one individual with an elected local government or state legislature experience, and we try to ask questions on that to see how much experience or would they have an experience that would really be beneficial to the city's needs. And another thing that we do ask as well is how well do they understand the city. We do provide some background in terms of form of government and how long the city has had lobbying services, but we also like to question to see if they have any close ties or do they understand what's going on not only with the city but also in Pinellas County in the Tampa Bay area.
Great. I think we're going to make time for one last question here, and I'll kind of just open the floor to whoever wants to jump in on this one. And that is, how do I engage my lobbyist or lobbyists on issues that come up during session but were not part of our initial priorities?
You just call them.
Yeah, this is Bill. As John said, we'd like to go into session knowing that there are 3, no more than 5 issues for a city that we're going to get graded on. When the session's over, we're going to be able to tell them how we did on those issues. But if you've engaged a lobbying firm for general representation and something comes up that you want to want them to work on, I think Candace said, you just pick the phone up and call them. And if they won't do it, then you pick the phone up and call Candace or John.
I agree. That's what we do. I mean, it happens every year. I think there's always one item that is not on the radar screen that comes up, or even they sometimes identify bills that we need to keep an eye on, and we just, I as staff report it to the city manager and to council, and then just go ahead and give the direction to our lobbying team.
Absolutely. If they don't want to pick it up, you need new lobbyists.
Good answers.
Okay, I was going to see if anybody else had anything to add. All right. With that being said, thank you for everyone participating in the Best Management Practices for Hiring a Contract Lobbyist webinar hosted by the Florida League of Cities. I especially want to take a moment to thank Candace Eriks, Bill Peebles, John Wayne Smith, and Rosemarie Call for their insightful and informative presentations. At this time, the webinar has concluded, but don't forget you can review the recorded version posted on the FLC website. Thank you, and everybody have a great day.